Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, Assistant Sports Editor for Multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joined for our weekly Penn State football podcast by Joel Haas of the Post-Gazette and the Daily Collegian. Joel, I don't know that we were expecting to be previewing a game this week when we signed off last week. Penn State obviously benefits from the Ohio State loss to Michigan. They will face Oregon at Lucas Oil Stadium in Indianapolis on Saturday at 8 p.m. So we got a lot to talk about. How does Penn State fit in the national picture if they win? I think more importantly, where do they fit in the national picture if they lose? Because I think there's a lot more possibilities there. We'll break down the matchup with Oregon's strengths and weaknesses. Then maybe get into a little bit of signing day, maybe a little hoops at the end if we have time. Before we do, just want to thank our sponsor for this episode of the podcast. It's Voodoo Brewing Company, State College. Enjoy world-renowned craft beer, delicious cocktails, and our almost famous lobster roll at Voodoo Brewing Company, State College, located right off College Avenue and Route 322 at 201 Elmwood Street, State College. VBC has something exciting going on every day of the week. Join us this fall on Mondays for weekly free play cornhole tournaments or test your knowledge with pub trivia every Tuesday at 6. Wednesdays are game night featuring board games, card games, and adult games. Every Thursday, your boy Dots hosts bingo, but this is not your Nana's bingo. Saturday, we have your Nittany Lions and college football on all day. We finish off Sundays with our weekly brunch paired with Steelers, Eagles, and Red Zone coverage. Can't wait to see you at the VBC State College Pub. Okay, Joel, let's get into this. I think the title of this video is pondering the question: would Penn State rather win or lose this Big Ten championship, given the rules of this 12-team playoff and where they would be seated if they win versus where they would be seated if they lose? Currently, as the number 3 team in the country, they're being projected as the number 5 seed, which would be, the highest you could get without being a conference champion. And they are projected to play Arizona State, which is outside the top 12, as the presumptive Big 12 champion in the first round at Beaver Stadium. Then they would play at the bowl sites in the quarterfinals Boise State, which would be one of the 4 highest ranked conference champions. If they win this week against UNLV, that's a pretty desirable road for a lot of people. If those are the 2 teams you have to beat to get to the Final Four, as opposed to if you get the number 1 seed in this tournament and you beat Oregon, let's just say Penn State jumps Texas by getting that huge victory, and they get the number 1 seed in this entire tournament. In the second round, you could be facing the winner of Tennessee and Ohio State, a tough SEC team, and then an Ohio State team that has already beaten the Nittany Lions at Beaver Stadium. So let me just pose the question to you, Joel. Before you consider anything else, and we're going to talk about what this game could mean for James Franklin's legacy. We're going to talk about the possibility that Penn State could drop below that 5th seed, in the final college football playoff rankings on Sunday. But just play with this hypothetical for the moment. If you're choosing between the 5 seed and the 1 seed for Penn State, which one do you ultimately prefer?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think it's a pretty big problem that this is even a conversation, just with the way that the playoff is formatted. Obviously, it's the first year with the 12-team playoff, so everything's new and everyone's kind of figuring some things out for the first time. And I think it was probably about halfway through the season when we first kind of heard the idea brought up that, potentially the 5 seed could be the best seed you can have heading into the bracket, just based on who you get to play. But I think ultimately, if you're Penn State, you want to win this game. I think you always want to win. And the coaches, the players this week have kind of echoed that same sentiment. Anytime it was brought up, that conversation was kind of shot down pretty quickly, as, you always want to win any game that you're playing in. Obviously that's, a tough task and easier said than done. And Penn State, is the underdog going into this game. But, if you had the choice, I think you always want to win this game. Obviously, you can look at, the potential matchups for Penn State as a 5 seed with, Arizona State and Boise State being probably the 2 worst teams in the bracket, if it were to fall that way. And would obviously be, Penn State would be pretty big favorites in both of those games. But I think the other thing to take into account is I think that the bye does matter, especially this late in the season, and especially when you're a team that's been a little bit banged up, just health-wise and things like that. You could win comfortably against whoever, Arizona State, Boise State, but at the same time, maybe a key player goes down. And then all of a sudden you're worse once you do finally get to the end and you're in the semifinals and finals and things like that. I think no matter where Penn State ends up, like, you're going to have to beat multiple good teams at some point. Even if you get the best possible draw from the bracket, once you get to, at least the semifinals, it'll be, very good teams remaining. And at that point, you're going to have to beat those teams anyway. So I think if you're Penn State, you want that first round bye because you don't get a bye now for Big Ten championship week like you once thought you were going to get. And so I think you'll always take the bye. You'll always take the number 1 seed, even if hypothetically it might be a tougher road. I think you know that you still are going to have to run into these good teams sooner or later. And so regardless, you're going to have to win, some of these big games eventually. And I think you take the 1 seed if you can get it.
I actually don't think it's a flaw of the system, Joel, to be honest with you, because I think the system should advantage conference champions. That should matter, especially as we're having all of these conversations about schedules and who's played who and whose resume stacks up. I think if we're going to find a year where the Big Ten is in the position where they're in a less favorable position like the SEC, and you're going to want your conference champion to get a bye. I think it's just the way it's working out this year that is bothering people for understandable reasons. But listen, you got a problem with it, Ohio State? Don't lose to Michigan at home. Especially in the fashion that you did. If you got a problem with it, Tennessee, go take care of your business and at least get into the conference title game. Listen, I understand from Oregon's perspective. Do you really want to see a talented Ohio State team sitting there? Listen, I would understand the reasons, but also this team just lost to Michigan and their fans are in revolt. That place is in turmoil. So if I'm Penn State, you're going into that game with nothing to lose, and Ohio State has everything to lose. So I think I agree with you. You want to be the number 1 seed, and I don't think it's necessarily a huge flaw in the system. As Reese Davis was saying the other night. Joel, I also wanted to ask you this question because I think this is a big part of the conversation is, are we even sure that Penn State would stay at whatever, number 3, number 4, whatever? Would they stay in front of Notre Dame and actually get that 5th seed if they lost the Big Ten championship game? I think you and I both agree that they should, but it seemed like Ward Manuel on the College Football Playoff Rankings show left the door open to, listen, especially in a circumstance with like Notre Dame, where these teams have been so close all season, that another loss, and maybe potentially it will depend on how Penn State plays. If you don't play well, what is the justification for keeping them ahead of this Notre Dame team with 2 losses? How do you see that playing out? And is that probably an argument for why you want to keep fate in your own hands and go out and win a game rather than rely on the committee to grant you this path with the number 5 seed?
Yeah. I mean, Penn State dropping is a very real possibility. And you can obviously argue, how fair that is considering other teams, that either weren't good enough to make the conference championship game, or in Notre Dame's case, just don't even play in a conference and don't even have that opportunity. Obviously you could argue about, kind of the fairness of it all, but at the end of the day, and I think we've heard kind of some mixed results from the committee regarding this throughout the last year or so, but most recently, Ward was asked about whether teams would be punished for losing in the conference championship game, and he said it is a data point that the committee has to take into account, and so obviously they're going to be looking at these games and adjusting accordingly based on the results, because it is a factor that can potentially move teams. I think if you're Penn State, as long as you keep it close, and obviously you never want to go into a game with the mentality of let's just lose by a touchdown, let's just not get blown. Like that's never what they're going to be telling the team. But at the same time, I think if you can keep it close and play a competitive game against Oregon, you should be fine in terms of holding your ground. But if you lose by maybe 2 touchdowns, maybe even more than that, then you're looking at potentially dropping, like you mentioned, below a team like Notre Dame or some of those other schools that are kind of right there creeping up on Penn State. And obviously that would be a pretty bad look, because there's, the narratives are going to fly after that about, Penn State should have opted out of the Big Ten championship if they're going to be punished for playing in it and things like that. But, at the end of the day, I don't think you can blame the committee. Ward, when he was asked that question, did say that, prior to the season, all of the, the heads of the conferences met together and they kind of decided that, we should be factoring these games in. So it was a decision kind of made by a lot of the different conference commissioners. And so they kind of agreed to this, and they're kind of getting what they signed up for in that regard. And, I think Penn State's in a tricky spot because they're probably one of the teams that can most be hurt by this. And they're probably also one of the teams that's most hurt by the formatting of obviously the conference champions, because, as we know, they're number 3 in the college football playoff rankings, but they'll be the number 5 seed. which they obviously get bumped down because of those auto bids. And so I think Penn State is kind of one of the teams that gets hit the hardest by some of these policies and some of these rules. But at the same time, if you're to look at it from kind of an outside third person, unbiased perspective, where you're not necessarily focused on Penn State and you're just kind of looking at it through that lens, I think it is fair to say that if you get blown out in this game, like, you can't pretend it didn't happen. You can't just ignore that. You know what I mean? You have to factor that into the resume. That is a game that you played. It is the same team that suited up for the first 12 games is taking the field on Saturday in Indianapolis. And if that team looks terrible, and if that team gets blown out by Oregon, you have to consider what happens there. And I don't think you can blame the committee for dropping Penn State if there is a poor performance. Now, I think the tricky part is, if Penn State does play well and it's a close game, and Penn State still gets dropped for a team like Notre Dame, because now the Nittany Lions have 2 losses or whatever. But you can obviously, then that's when you're kind of splitting hairs, and I think you can make an argument for both sides about kind of who should be ranked higher, and that's when things might get ugly. But I think, if Penn State keeps it close, kind of around the spread, which is currently at 3.5, if Penn State can keep it in that range, I think they should, be fine staying where they are, because that would kind of indicate that, Penn State did what it was expected to do. And it was the same team that that everyone thought it was going into the matchup originally. But obviously, if Penn State, fails to cover the spread or is pretty far behind Oregon, that obviously shows that they're underperforming where people thought they were. And, if that's the case, then they probably should be below number 5.
Yeah, I think it helps that Oregon's an undefeated number 1 team. I think there's situations where, if you're the higher ranked team going into a conference championship game and you lose, it should probably be judged differently. And then if you make it and you're facing the number 1 undefeated team, it's basically the best loss you could have. You'd have 2 of the best losses. Obviously, the Ohio State game is weakened a little bit, based on their loss to Michigan. But, there's all kind of different situations that would factor into whether I'd say, yes, that team should drop. No, it shouldn't. And I think, to your point, if you play well against the number 1 team, you should not be punished in favor of a team that isn't in a conference at all and basically gets to pick its schedule. So I think with specific regard to Notre Dame, that needs to be taken into consideration. Joel, here's my thing. Aside from all these conversations, I look at this as a massive game for James Franklin's legacy. The bugaboo about not being able to win the big one. All the years where you lost one game and you didn't get to play in this game because of it, even though you may have been the second, the third, the fourth best team in the conference and really believed that you should be there because of the divisional setup of the Big Ten. Now the quirks of the schedule allow you to play in this game, right? And all that bad luck over the years, you get this opportunity. My belief is that this is the most important game Penn State has left, other than potentially the actual national championship game. Because you win this game, regardless of what happens the rest of the way, you've changed the narrative about yourself. You've upset the number 1 team that was undefeated coming in at the Big Ten championship. That flag is going to fly forever. And, let's say you win one playoff game and then you fall out. You're always going to have that moment. You're always going to have that excitement. You're going to have that galvanization of, potentially being a number 1 team yourself going into the playoffs, the opportunities you could have for NIL after the season as the Big Ten champions, all of that. I think, to me, that's the most important piece of this from a program perspective. It's not what implications this game has for a national championship, because I think winning a national championship is going to be really hard. We've talked about it on the show. Winning 3, potentially 4 games, in the month of December and January is going to be difficult. And if you win this game, you always have this to fall back on, don't you?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think this game has the potential to be the best win of Franklin's tenure. I mean, you could obviously point to some New Year's Six games or even the 2016 Big Ten championship, but I don't think beating Wisconsin is necessarily close to potentially dethroning the number 1 team in the country. And obviously that's an extremely hard task, but Penn State obviously and James Franklin specifically have the opportunity here to kind of kill some of those narratives surrounding the program that, obviously they continuously come short in these big games. Well, here's another big game, potentially the biggest game that Franklin's ever played in. And obviously, the results would go a long way. And it, it extends farther than just this one game because, obviously winning the Big Ten championship is great. And I think Penn State's only won 2 or 3 Big Ten championships since joining the conference. And so obviously it would be a big moment for the program in and of itself. But in addition to that, you look at, if Penn State is able to beat Oregon, that's the best win that any team in the country has. To this point, no team would have a better win than that. And, you could argue Penn State also has the number one resume in the country, but Penn State could potentially be ranked number one if it can beat Oregon. And then obviously you flip that into going into the playoffs. You can potentially lock down that number one seed, the first round bye, all the things that come with that. And have potentially an easier path to the national championship. And so this game, not just because it's a Big Ten championship win, but also just the implications of what it can do for the program moving forward. And like you mentioned, it can pay dividends if you're looking at potentially recruiting, things like that. It can also galvanize the fan base and obviously bring in some more NIL dollars. I'm sure Penn State would be able to bring in a little bit more cash after a Big Ten championship win. And things like that, even if it's, indirect, even if it's not donations to the program, just, people buying merch, people who are excited about it, people who are buying tickets. And I know you get paid a certain amount for winning, each postseason game, however many thousands you get for each of those. So just things like that. I think there's so many different impacts and so many different things hinging on this game. And if Franklin loses, I mean, it's, the narrative just gets worse. That statistic that, everyone loves to bring up, his record against top 5 teams, which is obviously pretty abysmal at this point, and it'll just continue to get worse. And obviously the fan base won't be happy with that. And it can, a loss could obviously have the negative effect here. But I think the biggest thing is, Franklin only gets so many of these chances against the top teams. He had one earlier this year against Ohio State, blew it. He's going to have one against Oregon. And even after that, Penn State, regardless of, what happens against Oregon, they're going to make the playoff again, and they'll have another chance to win a big game. I think any playoff victory at this point could be considered a big win for Penn State. And so realistically, the next 2 games Penn State plays will both be big in terms of magnitude. But again, it's not often you play the number one team in the country and have the kind of opportunity that Penn State has. And I almost wonder if kind of having the unexpected element of it where, Penn State was expecting to be on its couch this Saturday. They weren't expecting to be heading to Indianapolis for this game until obviously, like you mentioned, Michigan upset Ohio State, which was huge news. And Oregon obviously didn't expect to be playing Penn State either. They were probably preparing for a rematch against Ohio State. And I think Penn State sometimes can get in its own head in terms of these big matchups. I think for a game like Ohio State, as soon as the schedule is announced, you look at, where's Ohio State? When do we play them? What do we have to do to prepare for that game? And going against Oregon, that's a team that Penn State didn't play in the regular season, hasn't really prepared for. But I think almost that element of surprise or unexpectedness might give Penn State an advantage in terms of it just doesn't have the opportunity to overthink this game. Like they have to go into this game with 6-7 days of preparation to get ready for Oregon. And it almost might, help Penn State to not kind of get in its own way, trip over itself, and just kind of stick to the process and what's been working throughout the season. So it'll be interesting to see, but definitely from a narrative standpoint, this game would be huge for Franklin specifically.
Let's break down the actual football matchup here a little bit, Joel. What do you consider to be Penn State's best matchup in this game, and what is its worst going against this Oregon team? Obviously, pretty solid defense, but they've given up points at times. Offensively, Dillion Gabrial probably is the best quarterback that they've faced, but I'm not sure that this receiver group at the same time is necessarily as good as what Ohio State brought to Beaver Stadium that you were competitive with. So how do you look at where Penn State stacks up against this team and where the strengths and weaknesses are?
Yeah, it's tough. It's really tough. I mean, they're obviously 12-0 and number one for a reason. There really aren't a lot of holes on this Oregon team, no matter where you want to look, whether it's, offense, defense. Obviously, Dillion Gabriel is probably a top 5 quarterback nationally and has some top receivers as well. They've got a good running game. I know Jordan James is already over 1,000 yards on the season. And then, like I mentioned, some of those transfers they have at wide receiver who have been doing really well. Tez Johnson from Temple, and then Evan Stewart from Texas A&M, who are both very good receivers. And I think if you're Penn State, the one area that you might be able to take advantages of is Oregon's defense. I think it's the weaker of the 2 units, although still very good. Obviously, that defensive line is extremely talented. And last week against Washington, Oregon had 10 sacks and I think 16 tackles for loss, just, ridiculous numbers. And so obviously a very talented defensive line. Penn State's offensive line is a little bit banged up there. But if you're going to take advantage of Oregon, I think it's going to have to be in the passing game. And, that's an area where Penn State hasn't been great this year. That's, kind of Oregon's weakness. It's, potentially the area you can get them. Ohio State had some success with that in the game. Obviously didn't win, but was very close and scored whatever 30, 31 points against Oregon. And so I think if you're Penn State, you need someone to step up. Obviously Harrison Wallace is questionable after missing last week's game. And so that would be a big hit to a big blow to Penn State's offense. But I think Tyler Warren, that's where you have to look. The one guy who's been able to consistently get it done in the passing game, and now he has an opportunity to do that. Obviously, Oregon respects him a lot. We've had medias. One of the cool things about the postseason is we get a lot more medias with the opposing team, and so we've heard from everyone, whether it was Dan Lanning or some of the Oregon players. They all seem to bring up Tyler Warren as a guy that they're keyed in on. But as James Franklin explained after the Maryland game, every team wants to stop Tyler Warren. Every team does whatever it can to stop Tyler Warren, whether it's doubling him, bracketing him, just trying to take him out of the game plan. And no team has been able to do it. No one can successfully stop him. And I think if you're Penn State, that's, you have to rely on your best players in the biggest moments. And Tyler Warren's that guy. He's, probably the best player on the team. You could argue a couple other guys, maybe potentially Abdul Carter, but for my money, Tyler Warren's the best guy on the team, the best, most talented player, and I think you have to rely on him in this matchup. You might be able to kind of pick on Oregon, I guess, if you can just consistently exploit, just keep hitting that Tyler Warren button, similar to what you did against USC. I think that the game plan to victory for Penn State is probably just trying to find success there. He's been pretty reliable, and Drew likes to hit him as kind of that, safety valve that, when everything else is covered, you just hit Tyler Warren. And I think that's what you have to continue to do. In terms of, the other side of that argument, mentioned it a little bit, but I think Oregon's defensive line is going to be a big problem for Penn State, a big issue to try and solve. It's potentially the best defensive line that Penn State will have to face this year. And that's an offensive line that's a little bit banged up. Anthony Donko has done a great job at right tackle for Penn State, is now out long-term, according to Franklin, which I assume at this point, if he's picking up a long-term injury, that means he's out for the year. And then at right guard, Vengayone has been, in and out pretty consistently throughout the last couple of weeks. Seems to be going down on the field all the time, gets tended to by trainers, and seemingly always comes back into the game. But regardless, he's obviously still banged up. And so if you're Penn State, you're a little bit light on that offensive line, especially if someone else goes down in this game. So that's certainly an area of concern that I would be looking at.
I want to talk a little bit about the receivers, Joel. Obviously, they've been a weak point in these big games lately. We've talked about that on this podcast, that they've basically no-showed, all the way through last season and this season. Anytime they played Ohio State, Michigan, Ole Miss in the Peach Bowl, they've done nothing. I think my question for you is not so much, are they going to go out and be able to dominate this Oregon secondary? Because I think you and I probably both believe that they will not. The question is whether they're capable of doing enough to, free up space for Tyler Warren, to make life a little bit easier for the backs, either out of the backfield or in the running game. What's your feeling about how they've progressed over the past month, and whether they're ready for, a secondary that's pretty good, but probably not quite as good as these secondaries that have dominated them in the Big Ten in these recent seasons?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to tell just based on kind of the level of competition that Penn State plays, where I think we've gone through the same cycle a few times now, whether, this season or last season, where, Penn State will play Maryland or UCLA or whoever. And, the receivers look good, and there's a few guys that pop, whether it's, Trey Wallace, Omari Evans, Liam Clifford will go for 100 yards or whatever it may be. And then all of a sudden Penn State runs into basically a ranked opponent or a top 10 opponent. And all of a sudden they fall flat again. And so it's kind of difficult because, you can look back at Maryland and say, well, hey, Penn State, looked pretty good there. Omari Evans especially was getting involved with Harrison Wallace, obviously sidelined, which is another thing, because if Penn State doesn't have Harrison Wallace, that's, a lot worse. That's your, quote unquote top wide receiver right there, who's going to be out. James Franklin said he expects him to come back, but I think the word was tweaked something last week, which kept him out against Maryland. But regardless, I just don't know if they're going to be capable of going out and performing against Oregon. Obviously it's like I touched on earlier, it's probably the weakness of the team if you could even pinpoint one. But a team like Oregon's not really going to have any major weaknesses, and obviously the secondary is still good players, and they've probably got a bunch of blue chips just based on the way Oregon's been kind of recruiting all around. And the success they've had bringing guys in through the transfer portal and things like that. So it's obviously still a tall task. for Penn State. And I mean, until I see it, I think it's hard to believe that it'll actually happen. But maybe they'll go out there and surprise us on Saturday. But I just wouldn't expect it at this point.
Yeah, I mean, the bar is not high for me, Joel. I mean, it's can you catch more than 3 balls, right? Like that shouldn't be asking too much of these guys, is it? Like I'm not saying like I want to see Trey Wallace go off for 100 like he might against a Maryland. I'm not saying I need to see Omari Evans catching a 50-yard bomb or 2 or 3 of them. I just think you need to make a couple plays, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe if they can find a way to scheme some of those guys open early, just to get a little bit of attention on them, even if it's literally, just some screens, some bubble screens, things like that, where they obviously, will be open, just something like that to get them touches on the ball, maybe build some confidence. And if the game does evolve into kind of a shootout, and you can kind of keep that pressure on, maybe you just kind of build off that momentum and keep it rolling, and maybe those guys are able to put up some big numbers. But things could get ugly fast if Penn State's not able to get into a rhythm early and not able to get the receivers involved, because obviously, we know Oregon's going to try and key in on Tyler Warren and potentially the run game as well. Obviously, they're going to have to respect what Nick and Kayton can do, especially with Nick being back at 100% health now. He's obviously looked a lot better the last few weeks, and his workload's gone down a little bit. And so I think, they're kind of saving him a little bit for this game, in that sense. And I think, they'll be relying on Nick pretty heavily as well, there in the run game. But yeah, I mean, it's just hard to, again, like you said, the bar is on the ground right now. Like, it's not a hard bar to clear, but when Penn State consistently in the past 2 years hasn't been able to clear it, it's you just have to think they're going to trip over the bar. Like, that's just how it's been. And again, I just, would love to be proven wrong on Saturday, but until we see it, I don't think you can expect it at all.
What do you think about the matchup with Jordan James in this running game? You mentioned him earlier. We've seen different teams have some success running the ball on Penn State. I think back to Woody Marks in the USC game. I think of pieces of that Minnesota game. If you look at the box score, Minnesota, neither lead back averaged more than 4 yards a carry, but there were drives where they were getting a great push and put themselves in good position. So it's kind of like the inconsistency that we've seen, right? Is you dominate Wisconsin on some level, but then you give up these drives to Minnesota. Even within the same game, you give up drives to Minnesota, and then you kind of dominate them at other times. What do you think of Penn State's ability over how they've grown in run defense over the course of the season and their ability to stop this guy this week?
Yeah. I think Penn State's defensive line has been great. I think maybe the biggest area that I could pinpoint for improvement has probably been from the linebackers, just kind of hitting the gaps and stopping those guys. I think Kobe King and Tony Rojas have both taken strides in that regard, in stopping the run. And obviously Penn State's defense has done a really good job and is probably a top 5 defense in the country and potentially the best defense that Oregon will face this season. So obviously it'll be a new challenge. But again, when you look at, Jordan James and what Oregon has in that running game, obviously has been very successful, and there aren't a lot of teams who have really been able to stop him. Even just like looking through his game log right now, his lowest yards per carry in any game was 4.1, which, obviously 4.1 isn't great, but it's also not bad. And considering that's the lowest, that he's had all year, and most of these other games are in the 5, 6, even 7 range in yards per carry. And you look at what he was able to do against Michigan, which has arguably the best defensive line in the country. He had over 100 yards, 5.1 yards per carry, and a touchdown against Michigan. And so I don't think anyone's really been able to successfully stop him. He's been kind of limited at times, I would say, but never really stopped. Kind of in a similar vein to what Tyler Warren's been for Penn State. And so that I expect it to be a focal point for Penn State. But the problem is, you can't key in on the run game because again, they have 2 great wide receivers as well, and a good quarterback who can make you pay and has been very, very efficient, very good, really good at ball placement, things like that, getting his guys open and hitting them in space and things like that. And so I just think it's going to be a huge challenge for the Penn State defense. You could say that it's the best defense Oregon's faced, but you could also say that for Penn State this is the best offense that it's had to face. And I mean, Ohio State's up there as well, and Penn State was good against Ohio State. I think it's going to take another great performance like that, maybe a pick 6, something like that would probably go a long way for Penn State in this one. But yeah, I mean, the defense is going to have to bring its A game for sure, in really every phase, but specifically in trying to stop James.
Do you think there's any advantage in Penn State having played all of the former Pac-12 teams in conference this season already, kind of gone about preparing for an unfamiliar opponent, um, multiple times as opposed to maybe you only got to face one of them this season like some Big Ten teams have? I don't know if it's an advantage, but does it help, A? And then B, what factor is this with Oregon coming east? We know that teams that travel east, in the NFL struggle all the time. The game time doesn't necessarily matter. That it's just proven by the data that when these teams from the West Coast travel to the East Coast, they tend to have a harder time than they otherwise might. What's your read on kind of the conference realignment impacts on this game?
Yeah, I do think it is a pretty interesting thing that Penn State will now have played all four of the incoming Pac-12 schools. In terms of preparation, that is a little bit interesting, just because obviously they're not schools that Penn State traditionally faces, and so in terms of trying to research them and come up with the tendencies and things like that for the coordinators, it can maybe be a little bit difficult. And even when you factor in the non-conference games, like those are teams that Penn State's not necessarily familiar with as well. So that's 3 non-conference opponents and now 4 West Coast opponents. So half your schedule pretty much of your Penn State is kind of these unfamiliar teams that you have to be doing a lot of research for. I think one thing that helps Penn State is they're getting Oregon after an entire regular season. And you can point to a couple common opponents that they've had in the Big Ten as well. So I think you can kind of use that data as a good data point. Whereas maybe UCLA, USC kind of earlier in the year, it was you didn't have a lot of tape to go off of, and the games that they had played were mainly non-conference games. So it was kind of tough to evaluate those teams. But I think with Oregon, they've put enough on tape at this point throughout 12 weeks that you kind of get a feel for who they are and their tendencies and things like that. I mean, I think there is some credence to the idea that potentially Oregon's been saving some things up for this game. Oregon the last few weeks hasn't had the toughest of schedules. In that regard, and we saw that they played a really close game against Wisconsin. You tend to think that maybe the Ducks are saving some things up for this game when they need it the most. So that could potentially, be a new thing for Penn State. They might throw some different things at Penn State that they're not expecting, which is obviously going to be pretty tricky to cover. But and then just in terms of the travel aspect, it's funny because I actually asked Dan Lanning about that a couple of days ago about, kind of his thoughts on having to travel out and things like that. And he pretty quickly dismissed it, said it wasn't going to be an issue, and that they had done it before. They had even, traveled to Indianapolis before earlier in the season, things like that. And so he was saying, he doesn't expect it being an issue. The team's kind of used to it at this point. Obviously, he's probably not going to come out and say that, yeah, we think it's, we're really going to struggle because of it. He's never going to really kind of show that weakness. And like you mentioned, there is some data to back up the idea that, potentially they'll struggle. I think maybe the biggest impact, I don't think it'll necessarily impact Oregon's play too much because like you said, like Dan Lanning said, at this point, they've had some experience kind of traveling out to the Midwest before. They probably have it almost down now into, to a science pretty much. And they're just such a good team that I don't know how much they'll really be impacted by it, but I think maybe one factor that could play into this is just the fans, the travel for the Oregon fans, and how many of them will be able to make it there to Indianapolis. It's obviously a much closer drive for Penn State, not necessarily close.
Tickets are cheap, Joel. I'll actually be heading out myself, so I bought some tickets, and I bought them about $30 more expensive than they are now. I think at one point you could get in the door for $7, which to me points to not a ton of demand. And to your point, the demand that is going to be there is probably going to be Penn State fans by and large.
Yeah, I think if there is any impact about, kind of the distance between the schools, it's just going to be that Penn State is closer, so it'll have more fans, and not to mention a much larger fan base than Oregon has, and a lot of alumni, even in that area as well. I know there's, a lot of Penn State alums kind of in that area, or even, a state away in Chicago, for example. So I think Penn State will travel well. I think the fans will be excited for the chance to play in this game. You look at, Oregon, they were, I believe, in the Pac-12 championship game just last year. And so it's, for them, I don't think it's, as big of a deal necessarily. And then once you factor in that, you're definitely going to have to fly if you're coming from Oregon. And so I think it's going to be a lot harder. And so I think if anything, the one factor that might be changed because of the distance is that, Penn State might have a slight home field advantage. I mean, I'm not expecting, false starts and things like that for Oregon due to due to the crowd noise or anything like that. But that might be the one thing that kind of plays into Penn State's favor, is just a little bit of a shorter travel.
Joel, one of the last couple questions here. I think the big common opponent that does stand out to me, other than Ohio State, is Wisconsin. Penn State obviously put them away in the second half pretty well with Bo Prabula at quarterback. Oregon struggled pretty much to the end. Do you read anything into that game at all, especially considering that it was one of the more recent ones on Oregon's schedule? And does it, does that help shape why this is a 3.5 point spread? Because I think a lot of people maybe thought that was a little soft for Oregon, that they're an undefeated number one team. Penn State has not won these big games traditionally. I think a lot of people might have expected the spread to be bigger on a neutral field. Instead, it's 3.5. Do you think the bookmakers saw that game and said, we think that this is going to be relatively close? And I think the thing I wanted to point out for the Pittsburgh audience is Penn State's roughly the same level of underdog that the Steelers were at Cincinnati last week, right? It was, I believe it closed at 3 points. This is 3.5. And the Steelers ended up winning that game rather convincingly. 3 points is not much in the betting world, especially in college football, Joel.
Yeah, no, that's a really small spread in college. That's basically Vegas saying that they view these teams pretty evenly. And obviously they give Oregon the slight edge there. And how could you not, based on how the seasons have gone? But that also, I think, shows a lot of respect to Penn State. I think I was a little bit surprised actually with how small the spread was. I was expecting it closer to maybe a touchdown, something like that. But in terms of just how Oregon played against Wisconsin, I personally wouldn't read too much into that game, just because I know Oregon, I think that was 7 or 8 weeks in a row without a bye. And then they had to go on the road and travel to Wisconsin. I think part of it is just kind of the wear that you take on throughout the season. I know their leading receiver, Tez Johnson, also didn't play in that game. And so I wouldn't expect to see that, kind of level of play from Oregon against Penn State. I'd be very surprised if they came out looking flat like that. And again, potentially just holding some things back there. But, they ultimately did what they needed to do to get the win in that game and remain undefeated and everything like that. And I think, when it mattered, Oregon was able to kind of take control and make sure they won that game. Obviously it's probably their ugliest performance of the year. You could maybe look all the way back to, week 1 against Idaho or week 2 against Boise State. But in terms of, Big Ten play and recent games, obviously Oregon's worst performance, but I just don't think you can expect them to come out flat in the Big Ten championship the same way that they did against Wisconsin. It is a little bit interesting to compare the way that, kind of how Penn State handled Wisconsin, even with Bo Prabula coming into the game. But I wouldn't read too much into it. I think Gabriel had like a red zone pick and a couple other things like that kind of went against Oregon there that maybe makes it look, a little bit closer than it could have been. But it's it's an interesting data point to look at, and I think if you're Penn State, you can obviously look at that film and say, what did Wisconsin do well that we can, kind of copy. And so from that standpoint, I think, Wisconsin did Penn State some favors there by maybe exposing some things. I think most likely they just, did a good job of tackling and things like that against Oregon. But yeah, I don't read too much into that in terms of, its impact on the spread and how people view this matchup.
Sounds like you're not picking Penn State in this game, Joel.
No, it's almost similar to our wide receiver conversation, where it's just I don't want to pick Penn State to show up in a big game until I've seen that they can do it. And I think this one is a little bit different than maybe the traditional big games against Ohio State and Michigan, just because it's a different opponent. It's not one of those teams that Penn State continues to struggle against, and just also the nature of it being a Big Ten championship as opposed to maybe a regular season game. So it does have a little bit of a different feel to it compared to those traditional Ohio State Michigan big games. But at the end of the day, I think Oregon's just such a good team. I mean, they're the favorite to win the national championship for a reason, and I think Oregon wins. I would take Oregon to cover as well at this point, just based on what I've seen. But maybe I'll be surprised on Saturday. We'll find out.
Yeah, I'm going to go the other way. I'm going to pick Penn State in this game. It'll be close, but honestly, I kind of envision a game similar to what they played against Wisconsin in 2016, where it got a little bit high scoring. They relied on their big playmakers to make plays at key moments, and a little bit of luck. I think of DeAndre Tompkins catching that long pass down the sideline. He wasn't a big piece of that offense throughout the season, but he comes through in the clutch, and I think you're right. I think the fact that these are not the same jerseys that they have gotten frustrated against in recent seasons, the fact that they're really not supposed to be there in a lot of people's eyes, the fact that they are going to play in the playoff regardless of whether they win or lose this game. I think they'll play a little bit looser, hit some big plays, and it'll come down to a couple at the end. And I just think, listen, there's only so much. Eventually, you're going to have a good game against one of these teams. Eventually, you're going to put your best foot forward. You're not going to get stuffed on 4 plays at the goal line. You're not going to have a touchdown ripped out of your hands as Trey Wallace did against Ohio State. Some of these demons have to subside a little bit in some of these big games. So I'm going to go with Penn State, maybe something like 35-32. Joel, thanks for joining me. You're going to be back here on the Post-Gazette Sports Now YouTube channel after the game, recording from Indianapolis, win or lose. So if you're not already, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Make sure you like this video if you enjoyed it. Help us out in the YouTube algorithm. We always appreciate that. Joel, safe travels, and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.